Hello, everybody. Welcome back to a very special episode of The Philosophical Liberal. I am coming to you from the 21st century here in the United States, where you can probably tell it is very much fall. At least it's a beautiful November. But Chris is visiting us from the Renaissance, which is perfect because we are talking about the Renaissance human ideal. And maybe we even kick off by you want to share kind of what you were sharing with me offline about how Florence is such a time capsule of the Renaissance period and maybe some of the pluses and minuses of that very idea.
Yes, well, great to see you, Joia. Hello, everybody. This is me calling in from Florence, Italy. It is dark here because we are 6 hours ahead of the East Coast. And as you can see behind me, I am in one of the many, but one of the larger public plazas, or piazza, as they're called in Italian, that marks uh, all of Florence in particular, but all of the great Italian cities. And this is the last of a series of trips I've been doing throughout this year that I kind of call my architectural immersion tour, for my own work and helping to build out my own vision, my own creative vision and architectural and aesthetic style that I'm going to be building into my own entrepreneurial work. I wanted to tour the world and see the best of the world. And I am ending my tour for at least for the 2025 leg of it in Italy, precisely because it is has so much history and has been so formative at so many different points in history for human progress and development. So we just thought it was actually very appropriate that we record this episode while I was here, and it just worked great with the calendar that it kind of lined up. And yeah, to Joya's point, just to kind of maybe kick it off, because we are talking about the Renaissance human ideal. I kind of was just reflecting on, I've only been here a day and a half now, but we're just reflecting on how Florence is a perfect time capsule of the Renaissance period, because when you get here, you feel like you really are back in that time of the 15th and 16th century, 1400s and 1500s, when the Renaissance reached its full flowering here in this city in the Tuscan region of Italy. But it, and that is amazing because you get to go back in time and experience and feel what it was like. But it also, we talked about kind of the both and juxtaposition of competing but ultimately complementary polarities in life, and order and progress was one of those. And the fact that it is frozen in time from 500 or 600 years ago kind of negates the progress side of that. So, it just is very interesting to be here again and to just be soaking up all the beauty of that historic moment, the Renaissance period, and what that meant, which we're going to talk about in a second, and to see and feel that in the flesh, but then also to kind of know that it's somewhat detached from modern 21st century life. And it really feels that way when you're here. So that's an interesting paradox being here. And I mean, we can get into a whole separate conversation, but so much of Europe, I think, is often like that. And so that's just an interesting commentary on Western civilization, or at least a big chunk of it, and how it has evolved. But not to digress and go down that rabbit hole, I am here in Florence, and as I'll just kind of pan around, I'll switch the view. This is kind of the plaza. One of the main reasons I wanted to come to Italy is, the Italians, they've been building cities for over 2,000 years. So in many ways, they're arguably, and I've been reflecting on this a lot on my trip as I've been going from city to city, but they're arguably among the greatest urban builders in all of humanity, and certainly human history, because they've had such practice at it. And so this is just one example of what they do so well, which is kind of the big open piazza with the grand structures. That's the Basilica of Santa Maria Novella. At one end, large civic, religious, and commercial structures, and then kind of framed by human scale properties and just colonnades like that, covered walkways for people to walk in that really just elevate the public realm. And it's just really beautiful. They build cities really well. And so, um, just wanted to give all the viewers out there a nice little view of it from your desktops, anyways. But I will shut up for a minute. And how about Joya? Why don't you, what would you like to say on Renaissance Human, or how would you like to kind of kick off this discussion?
Maybe we can kick off even by picking up on this idea that you put forward, the idea that Europe is maybe somewhat of a time capsule to the past. And I was sure, at least in my experience, I did think that my trip to Italy, precisely to Florence, to visiting the Renaissance, was maybe the highlight for me of that time capsule. Because if there were any time period that I would ever want to go back and visit, it would be the Renaissance. So, in a sense, I am so glad that it exists in that way. But I will share the way I even phrased it to you, and maybe to elaborate on this a little bit, is that it was a place that I love to visit, but you can't really live there. And it would be, in a sense, an injustice to the inspiration of the place to try to get lost in the past. So to build upon this idea. So if you think about Florence, when I go to Florence, I think about the great works of Michelangelo. And of course, he's tapping into something timeless about the human experience, something that is timeless and also magnanimous and magnificent. He has this vision
Mm,
of human potential that really is the glory of what human beings can be. But when you think about Michelangelo, he was a wonderful example of someone who was focused on both the timeless aspects of human potential and also the timeliness of being in his era. He was someone who was really on the forefront, the cutting edge of his time, of what was going on with anatomy, what could be done with marble. And so while it's wonderful to go to Florence and soak in all of that timeless inspiration and perhaps the particular inspiration of Michelangelo, if all you ever did was just stay stuck in the past, you would be doing a disservice to the spirit that was Michelangelo. If he were here, he would tell you to get out there into the world in which you live, to get out there into the time in which you live, to think about what are all the benefits that you can gather from what's possible to you in the era you live in. Sitting on top of the shoulders of giants is Newton's famous phrase, the progress that's available to you, and how do you make the most of it. And I think that does tie into what we're starting to think about, what it actually means to be a Renaissance. Well, people say the Renaissance man. I like to call this the Renaissance human, the Renaissance
hmm.
individual. I am definitely a woman, and I definitely think the Renaissance potential is open to me and ought to be open to all of us. But maybe you can
Yes.
share, precisely because you've been closer to Michelangelo for a few days than I've
Yeah.
been. So maybe from some of your inspiration, you can share just some of your thoughts of what you think it means in your life to be a Renaissance human, Renaissance individual.
Sure. Sure. And I like how you put that about how we have to remember that great creators of the Renaissance time, like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, all of these great creators, Galileo in the sciences, people like that, they were, while they tapped into something timeless, which we now see with the benefit of hindsight of hundreds of years of progress, that they largely kicked off, they were very timely and innovative. And that really stands out actually when you start to go to some of the museums here. It struck me in particular walking through, traveling through the Uffizi Gallery, which I just did this afternoon. And that's really the gallery of the Medici family and their former palaces that they lived in. Um, and most of the art in the Uffizi is medieval era art of the pre-Renaissance period, where the subject is almost exclusively theological and Christian, all about Christianity, religion. And the style is very kind of one dimensional and what we would now with modern eyes kind of see as a little bit, well, definitely anachronistic, but even a little simplistic. And then you see a sculpture like Michelangelo's David or Leonardo da Vinci's sketches, which even in context, side by side, the other works of their time just stand out as marvelous, radical changes and innovations in not only the style of painting and drawing and sculpture, but also the subject matter. They were now depicting man as we see him, as real anatomically correct men, but in heroic nude forms, even showcasing humans, men and women in the nude, was frowned upon in the medieval ages during the time that the church dominated. So even just that act was a radical act at that time. And so, you see that in context and positioning here, even in frozen in time Renaissance Florence, of just how radical that was. And so I think that's a key aspect of the spirit of the Renaissance, and what it means to be a Renaissance human is that you are original, that you use the technologies and tools of your time, and hopefully even try to create something new with them. Add your own unique, independent, individual voice to the culture and to the world in a way that not only expresses your unique potential and perspective as you, the individual who has never lived and will never live after you, but also that maybe says something new about the human condition and human potential and where we could go going forward. So, that I think is just one core thing about Renaissance human. And then, when I just think about the Renaissance human ideal as such, I was reflecting on that also today while walking around, and I think it really is about, and this is part of what's expressed in Michelangelo and Da Vinci's art, even of why they depicted man, the heroic, and why that was so radical of its time, is you consider the medieval period, the Middle Ages was a time when all of human energy and activity was directed at one single goal and value and purpose, which was God, the church, glorifying God. And the Renaissance really kind of in re they call it a renaissance because they rediscovered the wisdom of the ancients. And when we go back to those ancients, particularly Roman and Greek culture of the Hellenistic period, they were very much seeing man as a being with great potential, with a lot of capabilities, and that it is our job to cultivate as many of those capabilities as possible. So that's what you see, I think, expressed in these artistic works, was trying to reassert this view of man that is kind of this worldly grounded, and that shows that we are strong, capable beings. And so when I think of Renaissance human ideal, to me, it's not only that, like knowing your own power, reclaiming your power just in your own life, but then it's seeing yourself as a being with capacities and potential across so many different dimensions: science, art, uh, music, math, kind of all the different disciplines, which we sometimes take for granted now in modern education, that we learn or at least get a taste of all of these different disciplines. But, those are, kind of aren't second nature. We have to learn all of them and develop them. So to me, the Renaissance human ideal is very much one of building your capability across many dimensions. And that's why even the phrase Renaissance man or woman, human, today even evokes these people from that era who were not only great artists, but also great scientists and great writers and great thinkers, sometimes lawyers and businessmen, kind of entrepreneurs. So all of the, or, proto entrepreneurs of that era. So that's another key thing that I think really comes across in this period, is just this flowering of a very pro-human, life affirming, and kind of multivariable perspective on what's possible.
And I do think it really is a kind of rebirth, to get back to that concept of the Renaissance. As you're pointing out, that when we are children, we do think that it's just natural that children ought to be born and experience everything the world has to offer, all the glorious richness that is out there. And when we go to school, there is this idea that you should be well versed in all of these different subjects. And then, at least here, still in the 21st and I guess you're coming out of the 20th and 19th, 18th centuries, there is this idea that then you grow up and become an adult and have a career and specialize. And here I think this is another one of those examples where the real wisdom for the human experience is in the seeding paradox, in that you, I think, ought to strive to be both a specialist and a generalist. So maybe let's say a few things about the importance of being a specialist. So certainly this, I mean, to tie it even back to our organization 1776 forward, there is a real way in which it is markets, and as a free market advocate and a capitalist, I am definitely going to be in favor of specialization and the division of labor and what is possible when individuals do take the time to really go very deep into a specialized field and then attain a level of mastery that then allows them to trade with others. And I love the fact that we live in that society. There are so many specializations that I am so glad that other people want to go into. They don't necessarily match my own personality or skills or proclivities, but other people love them. And I'm so glad that they do. And so much better off for the fact that there are other people who, for example, just want to spend all day coding and build great computers, which is something that I would never want to do. But my life is so much better. We wouldn't even have an iPhone to be able to record this and bring this to you. So just one small example of how specialization is so wonderful and important. And at the same time, I think it's also important that we are generalists. And sadly, I think that just as a culture, we've lost the importance of being a generalist. The way that even as adults, it's so typical for an adult to identify with their career, with their role, with their specialization. But I would say, even thinking ahead to the future, this perhaps is one of the potential promises of the era of AI, where if we have these AI tools that will be able to specialize in certain areas at a level that no human ever could, what does it make possible is for human beings to discover yet again a richer identity that has multiple facets to it. And Chris, I've done a lot of thinking about what it could and ought to mean to be a Renaissance human. And I have 8 key areas of life that I've put forward that I think all humans ought to explore and have a certain level of knowledge and skill and ability and essentially bring into your normal routine daily life. And it is a challenge. I would say that even as someone who's sort of put forward this as an ideal, that it is a challenge to me to try to live up to it on a daily basis, because I eventually came up with 8 areas to explore. But I do think that it is the glory of living for us to try to do that. And I will definitely include a link in the show notes on this one so you can find my article. But I'll just run through it really quickly, the 8 areas of life. So the first one being entrepreneur, in the very broad sense of entrepreneur that we've been talking about, even in this series, where it could be starting up a business, but it could just be, the way I like to phrase it, starting up anything that's new, mission driven, and results oriented, that you make your own in that entrepreneurial spirit way. So being an entrepreneur, I have being an athlete, you're doing something for your fitness, the way that mind body fitness comes together, the inner game, if you're playing sports in addition to the outer game. That would be the athlete. The third would be being the, I never came up with a good term for this one, but I always just called it the relationship maker or builder. Just getting back to the importance of taking time in your life to build key, important, intimate relationships with others. The fourth one I called the financier, again, because money is so important. So just to have that knowledge and skill with how wealth is created and managed and invested and built up from what it is that you create. The fifth would be one that is particularly relevant to this project of the philosophical liberal, and this project and everything we're doing 1776 forward is certainly my way of living into this fifth role, which I've called the statesperson. At least my way of living into it for now, but the way that we are social, political beings, and we ought to be thoughtful and active in this realm of life as social beings. And then I also had scientist and artist to get back to perhaps the two that are most commonly associated with Renaissance itself. And then finally, philosopher, because there is a real way in which all of us as individuals have to confront the big questions of life and find answers that allow us to go through life and build up, create lives. So we do need, I think, to think about some of those big questions about the nature of the universe and how we know what we know and what are the values we ought to be pursuing, the virtues of character that we ought to be embodying. So again, I'll put a link in the show notes for this one, but that's just some more thoughts there. Now, unfortunately, it looks like I lost Chris on this feed. I guess this is one of the problems of trying to record with two people on different sides of the globe. Technology, I guess, makes so many wonderful things possible, but then it ultimately does have its limits. But I think that's fine because we were definitely planning to make this a two-part episode anyway, thinking about even this ideal of the Renaissance human. What is the Renaissance human ideal? And how does this connect with some of the other ideals that we put forward in our whole statement, but especially in part two of our statement, which we've been exploring here? And then I know Chris wanted to do just a special exploration while he is in Italy, just to share some of his own thoughts and inspirations about the Renaissance, being someone who has time traveled back to the Renaissance era. So there will be that you can look forward to as well. And then I guess I will wrap this one up for now and let you know to look forward to part two and our continuous exploration of idealism and being a Renaissance human. Thank you for watching this one, and make sure to look out for all these extra little add-ons in this episode. See you next time.